Okay. Hi, everybody. I can't see everybody, but hopefully you can see me. My name is Christy Scanlon Dobson. I am the arts accessibility person at Kansas Arts Commission, and we have been doing lunch and learns this past, I say semester, because I still have a kid in school, and we have been covering some really interesting, wonderful, kind of far-reaching topics about accessibility in the arts. And so I'm grateful to everyone who could make it today. I have met our guests today, Beth Bienvenu and Katharine Hayward, they're the NEA, but I met them through NASA. So we might have some NASA folks with us here today. They've been so helpful to me, and I've learned so much from both of them that I asked them if they would please come today and do a lunch and learn with us. And I'm just so grateful that they both could come. I'll let them introduce themselves and address any questions that you all might have about the NEA and what's happening with the NEA and what's happening with them. And I'm not going to speak to that because that's not my story, but I asked them to kind of focus a little bit on things that are happening in Kansas. They really reach out and do work with each state involved with NEA funding in a great way. And so I know they've kind of focused a little bit on Kansas-centric things today. But I will stop talking. And yes, NASA is the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, which of course Kansas and the Arts Commission is a part of. So I'm going to be quiet, and maybe I'll hand it off to Beth, and then Beth, you can hand it off to Katharine, however you two want to handle that. Thank you all. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will try to get those addressed. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Ben, and all of you that are joining us. A lot of familiar names from the state arts agencies and regionals, so it's great to see you guys. So again, most of you know me. My name is Beth Bienvenu, Director of Accessibility at the NEA. I can say that for another week. I'll give a brief visual description just for authenticity or for representation. I'm a light-skinned woman with shoulder-length brown hair, wearing a black and white scarf and a black sweater because it is only 59 degrees here in DC today. It's and rainy, so I'm back to my winter clothes. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I think you all are very aware of why all this work is important, and we look forward to sharing one last time this presentation that we have done for many states, and we are thrilled that we can do it one more time for the Kansas Arts Commission and for Christy, and yeah, I've been calling this the end of an era. But we know that all of you will be able to carry on this work, and we're excited to see what you all do. So we look at the agenda. We're going to be talking about disability and communities with some statistics, talking about the accessibility laws, regulations, and requirements, improving engagement for people with disabilities, some examples of physical accessibility and program accessibility, and then some resources and time for questions. I want to clarify, I am seeing mostly state arts agency folks, but I see a few that are not from, that don't seem to be from state or regional arts organizations. But so some of this will be review, but we, if we go to the next question or the next slide, we were going to ask all of you to indicate what type of organization or art form you represent. So if you're with a state or regional arts agency, you can put that. But if you are from a regular arts organization, presenting, performing, museum, etc., you can put that in the chat as well as we get started. So I'm going to turn it over to Katharine, who will introduce herself and get the rest of the presentation started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katharine Hayward. I am the accessibility specialist working with Beth for another week as well. We are happy to be with you all today. and get to engage as much as possible given the limited time and this format. As a brief visual description, I am a pale white woman with frizzy long hair that's behaving a little bit today, but it's tied back in a ponytail. I have a small, sparkly nose stud, and I'm wearing a sleeveless blouse that has sort of bright pink and red tones along with black because I'm on the West Coast and hoping eventually I'll be outside where it's supposed to be 85 degrees today. So before we get into some of the examples, I'm a bit of a data nerd, so we're going to be talking a little bit about statistics. But we also think it's important to introduce you, and many of you may be familiar with these different approaches to disability, but I think it's a good foundation for how we also approach the work in arts and accessibility. So, there are two kind of uh, there's lots of different models around disability, but there's two that have been talked about and sort of juxtaposed quite a bit. And when I'm saying model, really I'm talking about the approach and how we're thinking about disability, and where we're thinking that, change can happen. So with the medical model, which you still see in some places and was popular for decades, it really put the onus and sort of the problem, if you will, within the individual with a disability. And it was the individual that needed to be fixed, rehabilitated, whatever it might be, they needed to be the one to put the work in. And so it's the individual who must adapt. And in the social model, we really talk about how it's the environment that's posing barriers, and that an individual with a disability can thrive, or I take that to mean fully engage in their community when those barriers are addressed. So, to give an example, I have a mobility disability and use a wheelchair. And under sort of the medical model, it's not that, a building has stairs or that, that it's an old stage that's the problem. It's really that I need to figure out a solution. I need to exclude myself. I need to get better and adapt to the environment versus under the social model, we're looking at ways whether it be physical or program access that would really show that you want me to be there and be prepared to sort of adapt so that I can fully engage. Um, as well as, different models, there's a lot of different ways of categorizing disability, and this is not meant to prescribe certain categories around disability or even to say that the categories are what matter, but this is really just to make sure that we're thinking more broadly about disability. Um, for a lot of us, including myself at times, the first thing that pops into our mind when we think about disability is someone with a physical or mobility disability. But there is such breadth in the disability experience, and it's not even the majority necessarily of people with disabilities that, a physical or mobility disability is their primary one. So it's also important to think about sensory or perception disabilities. This can also include vision and hearing disabilities, as well as um, lots of other ways in which someone's senses may be heightened. Um, there's a lot of different terminology around emotional or psychiatric disabilities. I prefer, as someone who also deals with a mental health condition, I prefer mental health. But as you'll see later, sometimes you defer to the person. And really, the biggest group is people with non-visible or non-apparent disabilities. And this just means a disability that you don't see or observe right away, that it may take some interaction to notice that maybe there's something that could be done to sort of enhance the experience. And this can include a lot of chronic health conditions. Also, and this is sort of a newer term that you've probably heard, but maybe not. There are people who identify as neurodivergent, um, including people on the autism spectrum. That might be a term that you hear a lot, as well as those with cognitive or intellectual disabilities. And really, depending, there can be a whole range of conditions. Neurodivergent just means that people brains work differently. And so you'll also see the term neurodiversity, which is sort of referring to the fact that, well, yeah, this is natural. It's natural that there are different ways that different people process information. So, as I get into the data a little bit, we have our first poll question of, do you have a close friend or family member, or including yourself, with a disability? And we'll just take a couple seconds to see what the poll comes up. This is so cool. So I did this on our last presentation, and I was surprised, but honestly, I shouldn't be. I think it's just such a great way to show in real life that yeah, we all know someone, right? So at least in this poll, of which 9 people participated, 100% say yes. And when I think about disability, and I start to think about my family members, there are so many different connections beyond my own personal experience. So I'm closing that. Let me go to the next one. So, and this will sort of illustrate later when I talk a little bit about who's missing. But in terms of the data that's been collected through national surveys, in the United States, it's estimated about 1 in 4 of adults in the United States are living with disabilities, or 29%. And as we know, as we get older, things work a little differently. Maybe we don't see as well, hear as well, move as well, remember as well, all those different things. And we do see that among those 65 and over, there is a higher percentage of people with disabilities. So here we see 44% of adults 65 and over have disability. And this still makes the disability community the largest minority group in the United States. So, and that we'll just do this quickly in the chat, but do you think the disability estimate for Kansas is higher, lower, or about the same as the national estimate, which is 29%?
I'm not seeing anything yet.
I know it's tricky.
One person said about the same. Someone said, I would guess Kansas is lower because of the lack of reporting. Makes sense. And one person said higher.
Okay,
Probably
so
go
we
on.
got at least one of every
Yeah.
response.
Oh, Christy said higher, but agree with Kate about reporting.
Yeah, so you're already guessing some of the things I'm going to say about these estimates. But so this is a little bit of a tricky answer, which Beth and I were talking about the other day. So in terms of the percentage, Kansas is similar. The percentage is around 29%. But with the numbers, it's around 1 in 3 adults in Kansas are living with disabilities. And off to the right of this slide, I have a, a picture of sort of what's supposed to be the state of Kansas with 3 stick figures. One is in orange, representing the 1 in 3 adults in Kansas. And the number is 637,775 adults in Kansas have a disability. And this may or may not be surprising, but a cognition disability is the most common, with around 14% of adults reporting that they have a serious difficulty with concentrating, remembering, or decision making. And that is how they ask it. So, as some of you mentioned, there is an issue with the reporting in these surveys, and one of it being that this is just adults, so we're missing all the numbers of children that may have a disability. It's also people who self-identify, and there are a lot of people who may not consider themselves as having a disability or in the way that it's asked, a serious difficulty. So it's very subjective. And, there are other populations that see their identity in a different way. So, aging adults, at least in my family, no one would say they have a disability, even though they definitely would benefit from improved access, but they just see it as a natural part of getting older. Veterans are another example of a community where their identity is tied in a different way. And another major problem that, the disability communities had a lot of criticism about is that non-apparent disabilities like chronic health conditions, mental health conditions are not adequately asked about or explored. So all of this is just to say, and I think the poll speaks, louder than this other data, is that there are going to be people with disabilities that you're going to interact with as, colleagues, staff, volunteers, board members, artists, students, patrons, and visitors. So it's important to think of all of the different people that we want access for. And now I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Katharine. So over the years in our presentations on this, we would talk about, why it's important to be accessible. And for a while, I was using the term, the concept of the carrot and the stick, that a carrot helps lead the horse, or maybe it's a donkey in the metaphor, that it's an incentive. And then the stick is the punishment if you don't follow along. So the previous slides were to demonstrate that disability is very prevalent in communities, and it's an important part of your audience and your visitors and the people that you want to serve. But it's also the law, and I just want to say that I've been going through. Actually, if you can go back to the other slide, I've been going through a lot of old materials. I think Ginny Sanders has been around the longest to know just how much our office has done over the years. Going back to the 1970s, we were the third of all federal agencies to implement our regulations under Section 504, which I'll talk about in a second. And our National Council on the Arts issued a resolution in 1973 commanding us to begin to assume leadership in this area. So we after that, my office, which was called the Office of Special Constituencies, um, just took off and began a nationwide education campaign with the state arts agencies and the regional arts organizations, as well as local arts agencies, and then arts organizations. And then when the ADA was passed, there was a good baseline for a lot of organizations. So we'll go on to the next slide. So all of that just to say that we have been leaders in this for a very long time. And I feel honored to have been doing this work and excited to see so many state arts agencies on this call that are so interested in this work and will help us carry this on after Katharine and I leave. So the laws, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the act was passed in 1973. It took until like the late 70s for the regulations, the enforcement to start. But 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, such as NEA events, and those receiving federal financial assistance, such as NEA grantees. And state arts agencies, and et cetera. And one interesting thing is there was an amendment to the 504 regs requiring federal agencies to do their own self-assessment. And that I found documentation of us doing that in 1987. And there was a memo that said that we had the opportunity to get out in front of all federal agencies. And I don't know if we were the first, but we were among the first group to implement that part of the regulations. So a little bit of nerdy history. Next slide. So in 1990, the disability advocates knew that the Rehabilitation Act didn't go far enough because it didn't cover state and local government or places of public accommodation. So the ADA was passed. It was a bipartisan effort. And Title II of the ADA covers state and local government, so probably most of you here. And then Title III covers museums, performing arts, centers, theaters, galleries, etc. So basically, you're covered if you're open to the public. So next slide. So this means that all organizations are legally required, all except for some private organizations and religious institutions, but legally required to ensure physical accessibility of their spaces, provide reasonable and necessary accommodations for participants and visitors and audiences, and don't forget your staff, and ensure effective communication. And a part of this, and I think we're preaching to the group here, is to designate an accessibility coordinator. It's not just a requirement for state arts agencies and regional arts organizations. If you receive NEA money, you have to designate an accessibility coordinator. Doesn't have to be a full-time job, although we'd love it to be. It's a person to serve as a point of contact for arranging accommodations and anything else that your organization can and should do to ensure accessibility. Next slide. So accommodations can be made in different ways when they're with the accommodations that people might need. The bare minimum is to make them available upon request. So if someone needs an interpreter for an event, they can request that. But you can also go ahead and proactively schedule them for specific performances or dates or activities and advertise that you have that available. Like if you have a play that runs, they're going to do 10 performances, you could have ASL or open captions at 2 or 3 of those events. And then it's important to advertise it. But the best option is to include it as part of every activity. If you can offer ASL and captioning and large print and braille all the time, that's the best way. We understand that it can be costly. So, organizations have to do what's best for them, but it's important to make them available at least upon request and to advertise that they're available or how to request. So be sure to include the information in all publicity, such as press releases or programs or media, and to indicate what is available, that we will have ASL at these performances or captioning will be made available. And then also how to request an accommodation that's not already provided, any deadlines for requests, because you need to know how far in advance to book your interpreters or your audio describers. Um, and so make sure that your deadline reflects that, and provide contact information. This can be the accessibility coordinator. It can be a general information inbox or phone number so that people can reach out to make those requests. And I will turn it over to Katharine to talk a bit more about how to engage with people with disabilities.
Thanks, Beth. This is Katharine again. So one of the things that can be done that doesn't cost anything, and I know many of you are with state arts agencies, but if you're in this accessibility coordinator role, then you know that you're offering technical assistance to a lot of organizations who may not have funding to do as much as they would like. So, what are some of the things that people can do? And a big part of that is creating a welcoming environment. And I know that many of you have done this actually in different ways. One of those ways is to tell people through an accessibility statement by saying, "We welcome you, we want you here. Um, this is, where we are in our process. Please let us know what else we can do." And by having resources related to access services or other ways that they might be able to improve their accessibility. Another thing is to really, and this crosses over a little bit with program accessibility, is to have information about what to expect. So some people call this a planning your visit. I've been hearing know before you go a lot. There's different ways that people phrase it, but it's providing information on what to expect about the venue, the physical location, but also about what access is available. And, going back to what Beth was saying, who to contact if they have questions or need to request an accommodation that they didn't see. You can also, make sure that the materials that you're putting out or the content that you're putting out is accessible. Something that, anyone can kind of do is do the accessible hashtags, sometimes called a camel case, but that means that you are capitalizing the first word in that phrase that you're using for the hashtag. And this is because screen readers will not be able to differentiate. And if you don't have capitals for new words, it is just going to be mush when it is voiced. Also, captioning videos. And there's a lot of resources now where you can at least get a baseline. We do suggest, editing your videos. Don't just go with the automatic captioning, but there are some ways to at least get some of that captioning and transcript going. And providing alt text for images, which is, giving a description of what the most important part of what an image is trying to convey. And again, and this is something that we might repeat because if there's, nothing else you really get, is to make sure that people know who to contact and to promote the accessibility of your events. One of the complaints that uh, is hard for me to hear is when I hear, well, no one from the deaf community ever comes. Um, we don't have anyone from whatever community it is. Well, maybe they're not coming because they don't think that you're accessible, that you don't have something that's going to provide them to fully participate in the event. And I can speak for myself. Even if it's just information is hard to find, at a certain point, it's not worth my effort anymore. If I'm having to look all over the website to figure out, where the wheelchair accessible seating is, or if I'm coming with a friend who's going to need a sign language interpreter and I can't figure out who to talk to about that, um, or the process seems to be taking too long, that is something that, I will remember, and I will remember it for that time as well as future times. I've had some negative experiences at certain theaters in my area, and it's taken me a very long time to go back because, I think we all know the negative can stay with us a little bit longer. So you really want to make sure that you're providing a positive experience. Some of the different ways, in addition to providing contact information and sort of promoting accessibility, um, written. You can also use disability symbols, which we have on a previous slide, and we do have the link for those downloadable graphics. And there are sort of icons that easily, especially if you don't have a lot of space, or maybe it's a more visual medium like social media, where you can use those icons to convey very quickly that that you're going to have audio description or assistive listening devices. Another thing I often, when I'm doing technical assistance, when I'm talking to organizations, is I really encourage them to do their research, even if they're not getting a request for an access service at that time. Um, they want to be ready to go when they get that request. So to go ahead and research which companies offer which services, um, what are sort of the parameters of agreements. A lot of times, sign language interpreters will require that you book at least 2 hours, so you want to know that, because even if you're doing it for a 1 hour event, you want to know what is sort of going to be that process. And of course, like, pricing is very geographically based in my experience. So you want to find out what the costs are in your area. And then you can also use those costs in your grant budgets. So, as organizations are applying for their arts project, they can include these costs. Also, and this is related to some of my negative experiences, is that, it's very important that everyone involved in the activity is trained around the access services, if there's any particular equipment, and customer service, which is really code here for how to interact with people with disabilities. Um, but for some of these like very big events, I'll take, for example, a festival or something else where there's a lot of volunteers. Um, they need to know at least where to point the person, even if they don't know everything. They need to maybe know where, the access table is, or who they can talk to. And then for those of you involved in grant making, you want to make sure that the calls for art and the application process is accessible. A phrase that was kind of a mantra of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And we have the about us in parentheses because it's really shifting to nothing without us. Whether something is disability centered or not, people with disabilities have um, valuable insights and opinions, and you want to make sure that they're included in the strategic planning. So ensure that they're represented in your organization, whether volunteers, board, panels. And there's also ways you can engage with the disability community, even when you're just kind of getting going and maybe you only know one person or you don't know anyone. So really partner with organizations that serve people with disabilities, maybe develop an access advisory committee, and engage artists and other people with disabilities to be like user testers, like if you're doing a website design or something like that. And I'm going to switch it over to Beth to quickly review physical accessibility.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put this link in the chat to the 2010 ADA design standards, talking about physical accessibility. I also put the link to the downloadable accessibility symbols. So next slide. These are the basics for physical accessibility. I'm just going to talk briefly. And basically, it's how do you get in the door? And how do you get through the facilities? And actually, this was one of the first things that was addressed in the focus on accessibility with our 504 regs, was really looking at physical, but then we brought in the program. So are the facilities where your activities are taking place accessible to people with physical and mobility disabilities? This includes historic facilities. And this can include staff, volunteers, artists, participants, and audiences and visitors. So think about your whole facility and anyone that will be accessing it. And some examples is to think about the paths of travel. How do they get in the door? The ground, is the entry ground level no step? Are there ramps? Are there elevators? Directional signage is important, especially for entrances and paths, because you don't want people to be going all around your building trying to find the accessible entrance, because that can be very exhausting and often painful. Make sure that the seating available for people who use wheelchairs is integrated and dispersed throughout your seating area. If it's an auditorium, that may not be feasible. There might still only have options in the front and the back or something, but it's best to try to integrate it as much as possible so people have choice. And then think about, is there seating available in galleries and meeting spaces? When you think about museums, you're on your feet touring a museum, and having places to sit can be really important. And I know I've experienced that on many occasions. And then make sure that anything that anyone's approaching, like your box office and display cases, are wheelchair accessible and at an appropriate height. And of course, the basics are your restrooms and your water fountains. And now it's water dispensers for your water bottles. Make sure that your emergency exits have audio and visual alarm systems, and that they are not blocked, and that wheelchair users can use them. If you have parking, there is a set of standards in the 2010 design standards that tells you the ratio of how many accessible spaces to non-accessible spaces that must be available. And then think about your workspaces, including studios and classrooms, your backstage and dressing rooms for artists. That's often a real challenge and often unaddressed. Your meeting spaces and your break rooms. And and I also want to say, if your office is not fully accessible, you can have hybrid and virtual options, and make sure that your meetings are in an accessible location. But you have to be able to accommodate staff who need it. So pass it back over to Katharine to talk about program accessibility and effective communication.
Thanks, Beth. This is Katharine again, and this is sort of the last big section, and then hopefully we'll have some time to review a few resources and answer any questions that you may have. So there's a lot written about, and although it's like very technical, there's also very clear instructions around physical accessibility and resources around that. When we get into program accessibility, which is, just as important and is really about, kind of that core part of the experience, there is so much variation. So I'm going to be providing some examples, but just to sort of reiterate again the importance of communicating how to ask for an accommodation or who they can talk to about accessibility. Part of the reason that's so important and to have an accessibility coordinator or maybe for your grantees, an accessibility point of contact is a little bit more of a user-friendly term, is because it's really a conversation with the person with the disability about what they need, and what you can provide within the time frame and what's going to be something that the person with the disability is going to be happy about. And remember that this is part of the experience as well. We focus a lot on the arts activity, but all of those, what I feel like, are sometimes extra steps for a person with a disability, that is part of the experience as well. Um, when we're talking about program accessibility, effective communication is really is instrumental and key um, to what we're talking about. And when you think about communication broadly, this has to do with, how the activity and content is being shared, communicated, and also implemented. So for people with vision disabilities, although you'll start to see that there's a lot of overlap in some of these examples of accommodations in terms of what may work for one person may also be beneficial for another. But some of the things we think about for someone with a vision disability are alt text for images. Um, Art can be a tricky thing, or at least I would find it tricky if I was the one writing the alt text. So if you're able to, if it's kind of a program, um, that's in action, is to ask the artist to include. Um, I think the only challenge I have found there is artists will often provide way more information than you need. So maybe you need to provide an example, or, maybe that's where you become a little bit of an editor. But, working with the artist can really help to identify what's the most important thing that you're trying to convey in this artwork. Audio description, sometimes also called visual description, is another way to describe what people are seeing happening. So, an example would be someone that's performing a dance and someone who may be blind or have low vision. Audio description would allow them to follow the movements and understand what's happening. Having alternate formats of print materials, although I'm beginning to think just having print materials is probably an alternative format at this point. But thinking about having print, large print, braille, and then tactile opportunities, which this is one of those things that I think, who doesn't like to touch stuff, especially if they're not supposed to. I got to do like a tactile element in a museum, and I felt like so rebellious because that's like a place you're really not supposed to touch anything. And this can be, in this example, it was like these giant yarn balls, and I'm sure there's much fancier term uh, for what the piece was and what was involved with it, but they gave us pieces of the yarn that we got to feel while we were learning more about the piece that was created. So things like that, or leftover fabrics from costumes, 3D models of sculpture. For people with hearing disabilities, think about sign language interpreters, and most things are free or very low cost, but audio description and sign language interpreters do have a cost. So it's good to have a sense about that. Assistive listening devices, having captioning. There's lots of different types, including closed captioning, which many of us can use, like if it's a virtual meeting, as well as live transcription where a person's providing it. And then coupled with that transcript. So having that transcript, for example, like after a meeting or a training. So the second poll question is, do you use captions when watching videos, TV, films, or anything that you might stream? The options are often, sometimes, seldom, never. Ah, all right. So we've got 8 responses, a little over a third say often, similarly sometimes. And then we have one uses it seldom and one never. Well, the never person must have very good hearing and be an auditory person, both of which I don't think I'm very good at very uh, anymore. I definitely have gotten used to captioning, particularly in all these Zoom webinars and meetings, as well as a lot of what I watch. But again, this is all based on different needs. So it may come as no surprise that there's been research around captioning, and it may not be who you think it is, in the sense that the people who use captions the most do not tend to be older or necessarily have a hearing disability. A lot of this research has been done in the marketing world because they're trying to learn what they need to do to engage their customers. And they have found that 80% of viewers are more likely to finish a video with captions. 80% of 18 to 25-year-olds use captions all or most of the time. And there's been an increase in YouTube views of 7.3% after adding captions. And some of the reasons for this um, including kind of the imbalance of sound that we're starting to see more now in television and film, um, as well as, that it can help with understanding and concentration. And I know for me, it's not that I have to have captioning, but I do find that it helps me sort of maintain focus or follow along if I start to drift for a couple of minutes and need to see, like, oh, wait, what were we talking about? So it's not that surprising, but it's definitely being seen a lot in the youth. So if that's an audience that you're interested in engaging in, captioning can actually help. A few other examples I'll go through quickly include having sensory friendly or relaxed programming. And this just has to do with like adjusting the lights and sounds, maybe giving warnings for strobes, sudden movements, or very loud noises, being fragrance free, and having the ability to move around. Also content warnings, which, I've seen a lot of like back and forth about this, but it still seems to lean towards this is a good idea. And this was actually something we added after doing a training, and someone with a mental health condition reached out and said, you really should add this and think more about what you're offering for people with mental health conditions. So, quiet hours and spaces. This can be, for both people with sensory conditions as well as those with mental health conditions. Also, think about the language in which you're using and the reading level you're writing at, especially if this is for the public. So really just think about your audience, and sometimes you'll want to write at a higher level or use particular jargon or language that works for that area. But for the public, you really want to be looking at about 6th to 8th grade reading levels. Um, this is also sometimes called plain language. For easy read, and we have a resource here, that's looking at more at a 3rd or 4th grade level, and often involves even shorter sentences and some visual cues. I mentioned this earlier. having people available to answer questions, provide assistance, help direct people. And schedule time for breaks. So often, if we do longer than an hour presentation, we try to do, sometimes it's only 3 minutes, but at least a quick break for people to stretch, get water, do whatever they need to do. And then, as Beth mentioned earlier, keep hybrid options or live streaming. And I'm so happy to see that a lot of this is continuing. Electronic accessibility. So this is going to be so brief because honestly, this is a whole presentation unto itself. But almost everything that you would do for something in person, you still want to do virtually. So whether that's have audio or visual description, captioning, or sign language interpretation, those are all things to have in both formats. When we're talking about websites or galleries, it's also important to think about screen reader navigation and tab controlled websites. And you also want to think about color contrast, accessible fonts, and alternative text for images. And I will switch it to Beth to just go over a couple of resources.
Thanks, Catherine. If you go to the next slide, we've talked about our Careers in the Arts Toolkit many times, so I won't go into it, but you can check it out, arts.gov/arts careers toolkit. The link is in the chat. It has a lot of really great resources for people seeking careers in the arts, for people with disabilities. Next slide. So these are some general accessibility resources. If we don't get a chance to put them in the chat, we will. I'm assuming the PowerPoint will be sent out, and you can access them there. Some of these, from the NEA, might shift around or go away, but I think that most of them will still be there. We're hoping that the ADA National Network will be able to continue to operate. You can check out your nearby regional ADA center and some other resources. And then the next slide is some electronic accessibility. We talked about color contrast. There's a color contrast checker there. You can evaluate your website. And so there's just a number of resources there. And I think that's it. We have time for questions.
I've heard you both speak multiple times now, and I think a lot of my colleagues from NASA are here today. Thank you all for joining us. One of the things that always pops out for me is making sure you have representation and diversity and connection on your board and on your staff, and making sure that the disability community is represented there. I think it can be easy for arts organizations to, you're building a board based on who is legal and who can fundraise and who has connections here and there and everywhere, but making sure that you have the disability community represented in that body and on your staff. And it's not even just your staff, people who are working on marketing or fundraising or whatever, but on your stage, that there are people with disabilities who are your actors and your performers. That always sticks with me.
Yeah, and also if having them on your grant review panels is really important, because they can provide, really valuable insights into your grant applications. So yeah, representation is really important, and to have a variety of disabilities represented.
I just want to jump in. This is Ben, and you can put questions in the chat, or if you'd rather voice them, just go ahead and raise your hand. Click the little button that says to raise your hand, and I will have you unmute so you can ask that question. Otherwise, you can put that in the chat.
This is Catherine as a follow-up to what the two of you were just talking about. I think also if you have an opportunity where you have a little bit of funding and can pay artists with disabilities or people with disabilities to be able to form an access advisory committee. And you can kind of determine how often they meet, what the responsibilities are. I know some when they first start, they meet more regularly, but then there are other times they, it's basically a group that they can go to get input to make sure they're going in the right direction. And so they may not meet for a while and they're doing strategic planning and they want another pair of eyes and making sure that they're addressing concerns of the disability community within their strategic plan. So, it's something that can function in lots of different ways within the scope of um, a budget, but we always advocate that, this is an expertise. This is an area of expertise, and you should pay um, people commensurate with whatever you would be paying other people that you deem an expert, if that's as a speaker, if that's as a user tester, whatever.
Yes, I love the advisory committee idea too. Thank you, Catherine, for reminding me about that. That's really great.
And this is Ben again. I had a quick question. Just you've covered so much ground, and Beth and Catherine, thank you very much for sharing today. You've got a great presentation, and you've got it down to really focused and concise and useful information. Really appreciate that. If a small organization somewhere, especially in Kansas, wants to take a step, knows they want to make sure they are more accessible, but aren't sure, there's a lot of places they could go here. If there's just one thing, if you'd say, well, just do this, here's one thing you can do even today to take a step towards getting more accessible, what do you think that would be?
Catherine, do you have any thoughts?
I know my answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
Some of you may know it. It's something I always squeeze into technical assistance. But I think a good place to start is to figure out who that accessibility point of contact will be. And we didn't get into it as much here, but in other presentations, we always talk about, accessibility is a team effort. The point of contact, the accessibility coordinator, is just the person taking point. They're not the only person who should be working in this area. But I think having that person and, having an accessibility statement, I think you have to indicate that you're willing to have these conversations, that you're willing to work with a person. And that's something that you can do right away. And it's okay to be making changes and learning as you're going.
And that, to be clear, that's something an organization could do today. You choose a person that doesn't need to be someone that has extensive training and education in this subject, but just to have that person named and chosen. Thanks.
And I would say taking a look at your communications and making sure that you're including accessibility information and how to make those contacts, and that take a look at what you're already offering and see what else you can offer.
And in the chat, we did have a good suggestion here. For one thing, giving a contact name, email, or phone number, and adding a question at the end of every event registration or grant application. And that question is, do you have any requests that would make this more accessible?
Mm-hmm.
Nice,
I like that.
open question there.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I like that, because not everybody knows what an accommodation, the word accommodation may not resonate, but having, what would make it more accessible is a good approach.
Mm-hmm. This is Catherine, and I think that goes a long way, and maybe I'm just speaking more personally as a person with a disability, but if I feel like someone is genuinely trying, I'm willing to work with them. it's when people are defensive or like, how can you expect me to do that? Why should I do that? I don't have enough money. When they're already, before we've even had a conversation, kind of signaling to me that they like that's signaling to me you don't want me there. So when you open yourself up and are showing that you're trying, I think the vast majority of people are really going to be receptive and more willing to work with you. Because maybe if you haven't done it before, you don't get it right away. But if they know that you were really trying, like that's the beginning of a relationship.
I love that, the question, Ria, hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about, yeah, what could we do that would make this more accessible? My experience teaching as a teaching artist, even here in Lawrence at the Arts Center, is making sure that when families sign up, if they're signing up a kiddo to take a theater class with me, that we're asking that question, because I need to know, it would be better for the kiddos to know what needs are coming into the class with me. Like, what is it that I can do as a teacher to make the whole experience more accessible? And I feel like we've missed those questions at times. And then I have kids coming in to work with me and they have needs that I was not prepared for. And that's on me. I need to make sure that I'm communicating with my class, with parents. What can I do to make this class really wonderful and accessible for so-and-so? And I think it's just making those, just thinking ahead.
And that applies to everybody. Everybody can use some type of accommodation. We had a listening session last fall to ask artists and other people with disabilities working in the arts, what would make your work more accessible or no, safe, healthy, and productive. That applies to everyone. Being able to tweak your schedule because you have childcare or because it takes you a long time to get ready in the morning due to your disability. Having more frequent breaks because because of a health condition, you need to rest, you need to take medication. These are the kinds of things like in any job situation, there are things that people need to be able to do their job effectively, and that applies to experiences in the arts as well.